Thank you, Richard. It's really great to be here, and especially great to be among people who have an interest in China painting. And even if it's just a curiosity, I hope by the end of the evening it's a genuine interest. These two pieces you've seen before if you got the invitation, and you'll see them again, and they're on the catalog. There will be a catalog. So at least come back for that. You'll want to come back and look at the exhibit again, I'm sure. Painted porcelain, now let's see if I know how to do this. Painted porcelain was of interest to royalty and to watchers of royalty throughout the 18th and 19th century. And here I show you an image of Sèvres porcelain exhibited at Marlborough House in 1852. A Sèvres porcelain and a typical sort of Sèvres piece up in the corner of rose pompadour, potpourri decorated with cupids and flowers, and the little there's little bits up here. These are alternate decorations for the vignette there. So this is the sort of thing that people were really interested in the 19th century. And the factory, oops, I did this. Have I done the wrong thing? No, I know what it is. There we go. The factories I'll get it. The factories were also happy to provide for this interest in painted porcelain. This is Christophe Diehl, who was a principal of Diehl and Gerhard, a very important Paris porcelain maker. Those are the dates up there, 1781 to 1824. And he was also well known and recognized for his support of the art of painting on china. And he experimented with many effects. And you can see him, he's been painted by, sorry, I've forgotten who the artist is, but painted at a typical activity, experimenting with paints. He has his little grinding palette here and a glass grinder, and he's been grinding some metallic oxides, perhaps taken from one of these jars behind him, with an aromatic oil, and you see that up there. And he's making out a palette of colors to use for painting something. No doubt a fancy plate like you see down here in the corner. Meissen is another one of the great factories of Europe where painting was carried on extensively from the very beginning. And you can see here the decorator using, again, the same ceramic slab for grinding, and also they use glass slabs for mixing colors. Here's oils. Here are examples that he's following in painting this particular platter. And I want to stress for you that these are painters, and everything that you look at in the exhibit is painted with metallic oxides suspended in aromatic oils. It's very much like canvas painting, although people don't recognize that because vases and plates are three-dimensional objects, and most observers don't think about them as being canvases. But they're three-dimensional canvases rather than two-dimensional canvases. What I want to be very clear is that we're not talking about printing. And it's very hard when you look at these objects for the first time to understand that they're actually painted by hand. Transfer printing, which is the great discovery of the mid-18th century of the English potteries and leads, of course, to the distribution of ceramics, much wider consumers than had been previously. I'm not denying that this isn't an important part of technology and ceramic technology. It definitely was. But that's not what we're looking at with this material. We're looking at true hand painting. And I'm going to give you a little background on this and hope that you understand what an amazing achievement this was for this town that people don't even think very much of today, except the citizens of New Jersey, because it is the state capital. This is a little quiet Trenton of the 1830s and 40s. Nothing much there to recommend it as the center of anything, except that it was a place where raw materials were brought, transformed into lumber or flour, and sent to cities, Philadelphia or New York, via water transportation. And it was that location that recommended it to the ceramic industry. The ceramic industry starts there in the 1850s, and by 1900 you can see that it's grown to quite a factory town full of these periodic kiln cones where they fired the ware. And Walter Lennox was born in, I didn't write it down, but I think it's about 1856. So his boyhood and adolescence coincided with the rise of the industry. He was very interested in art. He thought of himself as an artist, and he figured out a way in his moving about town, listening to other people talk, he figured out a way that he could apply art to industry. He studied with the best painter who was working in Trenton at the time, Elijah Tatler, an Englishman who had worked in Greenpoint, New York, and Trenton, and moved back and forth. And they were making really kind of boring things, door plates, decorating door plates, and the knobs on furniture, and all kinds of ordinary stuff. Nobody was making in town anything really spectacular because this was the American pottery industry, and everyone told them that you could only make good things in England or in Europe, and you couldn't make anything good in America. So this is the sort of small stuff they were doing, and Lennox wasn't a stupid boy. He learned how to paint, and he also made friends with his age peers in town who were the richest. These three men, especially R.V., Fred, and John Kuser, whose family had the most money in town, were buddies of Walter Lennox. And when he needed money, cash infusions for his potteries, he went to his friends. So he's a very clever lad. And in his cleverness, he figured out that these are the two art ceramics of his adolescence growing into becoming art, the two kinds of European art ceramics that were traded in the United States and held in very high esteem. This Irish Belique piece is actually from the second period, but it's available in America by the 1860s. And Irish Belique, if you've never handled it, I'll just explain briefly, it's very thin body but very sturdy. It's porcelain, it's slip cast into elaborate shapes and then covered with a pearly glaze. The English aesthetic decoration is mostly done in Mintons and Doltons and so forth as raised gold pastework with some infill of colored enamels. And you can see this, it's a good example in the plate on the right of Mintons. It's a piece that was sold in Philadelphia. It's dated, if you read the Mintons mark, 1879, and it shows that classic kind of English aesthetic decoration. Walter Lennox, we're talking about now, was inspired by these artwares, and by the 1880s he was working first for Ottenbrewer and next for Willits Manufacturing Company. And what he did was to take these extravagant shapes, like the one you see on the left from Ottenbrewer, and then applied the English aesthetic kind of decorating to that surface. So this was a completely new product. He was instrumental in bringing the workmen from Ireland to create this Balique type of body in America when he was working at Ottenbrewer, and this became so important in the art market, this ware at Ottenbrewer, that Willits Manufacturing Company hired him away, and he took his workmen with him and continued to make the art wares at the Willits Manufacturing Company. But since he was hired as the art director, the art director, he had to oversee other sorts of things too that he didn't find very interesting. And that was making common tableware with transfer printed patterns. He didn't find that. He designed the patterns and he oversaw the making of it, but his real interest was in this art porcelain. In 1889, he founded the Ceramic Art Company. He talked a few people, not the Cousers yet, he called on them later, but he found some people in town to give him some extra money. He actually left the Willits Manufacturing Company because they owed him money, and he sued them for back pay, and that forced Willits into bankruptcy. They eventually emerged from bankruptcy, and Lennox got his money, and that was the down payment for his new little pottery. So it all worked out. And this is the original building. This, pardon me, this photograph is taken about 1897 and shows the progression of the building through time from 1889. The first building on the front, pardon me, this building on the front is the first building they built, and it was constructed so that if the pottery failed, they could turn the building into a tenement. Excuse me. Financial people always have a way out. Or get somebody else to pay for it. So you have a little bit of an idea of how he cobbled together this factory. One of the things I really like about this photograph is that you see the mold room was on the third floor. And this is where they threw all the old molds out after they were finished with them, just right out the window, and somebody collected them at the bottom. Manufacturing is not a pretty sight. So Lennox, Walter Lennox, aimed high in the creation of the Ceramic Art Company. He was able to attract the best artisans and artists because he had been working in these important factories, Ottenbrewer and Willits. He already knew people who were in the United States and working, and word got out that he was looking for the best artisans and artists. And at the beginning of his little company, there were only 50 people who worked there, making the porcelain and decorating it. So it was really like an art studio. The early work was really exceptional painting on a beautiful ivory-colored body that transmitted light through the paint. And one of the things I'll draw your attention to when you're looking at the exhibition itself is that the spotlights that are on things really help the paintings come alive, because you see light through the painting in a way that canvas can't really do. It's a little bit like the way that watercolor, that the white paper of watercolor puts light into and liveliness into a watercolor painting. But you'll see in the exhibit, in the objects themselves, how this very magical body captures light and then sends it through the colored surfaces. The large vases had big expanses like a canvas, and those were treated as paintings, and you can see in this glimpse of the artist's studio how they portrayed themselves as an art. Here's the blanks lined up on the side in shelves, and here's finished pieces that have been put out for the artist or the illustrator who did this illustration. But you see them working like this chap in the front. He's working on a vase. He's using an easel for his wrist rest, to hold his wrist against the wrist rest to work on the vase itself. And I think you can see that it's a very a dignified place to work. The men are in jackets and ties and high collars, and the women are clean and dignified. And that's what an art studio was supposed to be like in those days. And two of the vases that are in the exhibit, and I hope you'll go out and look at them, are typical of the wear in this early period, the 1890s, and very early years of the 20th century. The thing I like so much about these is, and the difference, here's where painting on porcelain and painting a canvas are yield two very different things. And when you paint a canvas, you have, here's the right part of the canvas, the middle part, and no, here's the left, sorry, I'm a little dyslexic. The left part of the canvas, the middle, and then the right. And when you paint on a vase, your landscape or whatever the scene is that you're painting is continuous. You can keep moving around and around and around the vase, and you can get lost in the painting, especially the Nosek painting of Edelweiss. It has a focal point in the figure of Edelweiss, the flower that attracts men to their deaths. But when you look at the vase itself and start to walk around it, you'll see that there's a landscape on it that carries you continually around. And so that is the one point where paintings on canvas and paintings on vases really digress. And from my point of view, it makes the vases better than the canvas paintings. Don't tell the art historians that. They don't want to hear that. This is a wonderful monumental vase painted by George Morley, who was an English artist. And you look carefully at this, you'll see it actually has gilt bronze mounts. And these early vases were like this. They provided, from the Ceramic Art Company, provided large expanses to paint on. This was very extravagant material. It was expensive in its day. It was almost all of it was produced on commission. So the business came through large urban jewelry and silver dealers like Tiffany's or Bailey Banks and Biddle, and by that I mean the old Bailey Banks and Biddle, not the new Shreves. These great names in that handled valuable decorative arts of their era handled the Ceramic Art Company's goods. The retailers ordered from trade catalogs produced by the Ceramic Art Company that were only shapes. And then it was up to the either the retailer or the customer to suggest what they wanted on what scene, what view, what subject they wanted painted on the vase. So the vase is it shows the skill of the painter, but the choice of the subject is usually up to the customer. A reporter in 1905 noted that painted vases ranging in height from 15 to 30 inches. And I think this one, oh, I have it on there, is 27 inches tall. So he's talking about vases like this. Were sold for $700 or $800 up to $1,500 each. And this was an enormous price in those days. I looked it up. The internet is so good. I looked it up, $1,200 as a round number, and that would equate to about $30,000 today. So that's a substantial amount of money to go out and buy new art, contemporary craft today. Even to go and buy contemporary craft by uh, um, artists who are considered sculptors or painters, $30,000 would buy you a lot. And it bought a lot in the 1890s too. These vases had all sorts of things on them. The same reporter described a, quote, dainty porcelain vase 6 feet tall. The little tongue-in-cheek. Exquisitely decorated in fairies and cupids and flowers, which had been sold to a dealer for a number of thousands of dollars. Only the dealer knew how much the customer had to pay for that. Now, in 1902, the Ceramic Art Company began making plates. And these are a little bit different than the vases. They continued to make vases, but they also started making these plates. And I just have a quick comparison here of a of a Dresden plate. These buttons are so small. This is actually painted in Dresden. It's about 1890, and it's a painting of the Duchess of Devonshire after a canvas painting by Thomas Gainsborough. And I compare that quickly with Ceramic Art Company plate painted by Bruno Geyer, using as the model The Parson's Daughter by George Romney. These are even more fun as paintings because they're miniature paintings, 10, 12 inches across, and they come with their own frames. Isn't that fun? See how this mimics a fancy gesso and wood carved picture frame. In the same way, this does too. And so these were little paintings, and they were used as place plates. I'm going to show you some more here. They were used as what I call place plates, and we have set up in the exhibit a little suggestion of that. They were there for fancy dinner parties. You would come into the dining room, and this little painting was at your place to greet you. And then, of course, whisked away immediately so that the plates for serving food could be brought in. They are different. Usually they don't have decorated centers. They might have similar borders, but they wouldn't have the same centers. So this is a real extravagance to buy these almost miniature paintings, put them on the table, and have them there just to greet your dinner guests. They used a variety of sources for these paintings, and as I said, the customer would bring that up to the painter. In this case, we have some plates painted by Bruno Geyer, ordered by Franklin Murphy when he was governor of New Jersey for use in his private residence in Newark, New Jersey. And he chose as sources postcards that were made from Angelo Asti, a Franco-Italian artist. Asti painted these portraits of beautiful women on silk, and then they were translated into calendars and postcards. So you can see how that source worked there. And as I said, there were a variety of visual materials were used. Queen Louise was a very popular topic. You can see her here after the painting by Gustav Richter of 1879. And on the right, the original, on the far right, you see the original water carrier by Charles S. Pierce, and then the tankard painted by Anthony Heydrich on Ceramic Art Company blank. And the Pierce, both the Pierce and the Richter paintings were would have been known to many people from chromolithographs that were published and owned popularly and framed and put up in people's homes. This is one of my favorites in the show. The plate painted by Bruno Geyer, which you see on the left, is titled on the back Janice Meredith. Janice Meredith was the main character of a novel by the same name by Paul Lester Ford. It was published in 1899, and 200,000 copies isn't a runaway bestseller today, but that was a lot in 1899. And it was a story of Janice Meredith was a complete fabrication. This is a historical novel. She knew both George Washington and Paul Revere, so she was very well connected in the American Revolution. And we know they got together frequently. And it was so, it was such a hot topic that there was a popular play made out of it too. And you see each of these oh darn, I'm sorry. Each of these images, you can see this same hairdo. You can see, I think, clearly from the Geyer plate that he took the image from the cover. This is the cover of the book, pictorial cover. And of course, when it was made into a play, this is Mary Mannering, important actress. She had to do her hair up the same way because it was known, that hairstyle was known as the Meredith curl in its day, and ladies they would have recognized this immediately when they came in to sit down at the table. There's Janice Meredith. You know, they wouldn't even have to turn the plate over to find out that that was Janice Meredith. They would know it immediately. And while some, and that's what's so interesting about these plates when you really get into studying them, some of the sources are very highfalutin. I'm going to show you that. Some of them are really popular, getting right down into popular American culture, and others are very highfalutin. And this is Angelica Kaufman's self-portrait, very well known by people going through art books. She was a really favorite character, female artist, you know. In this era when the role of women was changing so rapidly in society, it's very interesting to see the way that women are depicted on these plates. And these I hope you'll go and look at because we have Bruno Geyer's interpretation of the Kaufman painting and Hans Nosek's interpretation. Two artists from different backgrounds. Nosek was Bohemian. He grew up in the factories, learning to paint in the factories of Bohemia, whereas Geyer is not far away in Austria, but working in a very different style. Most of the artists came from abroad. William Morley, who you see here in the photograph, he was photographed in the 1920s, working in his studio. By this time, the company is called Lenox China Company. And we have to look at in the exhibit two plates painted by him, both with roses, but the small one is dated 1884 and was painted when he was still living in England, and the larger one is many years later. This is almost 40 years later at Lennox in Trenton. The differences, and you'll see when you look at them, you'll see in the 1884 he's already an accomplished artist, but he's working in the style popular in that era, and by the 1920s the painting style is a little softer, and the brushstrokes are more suggestive. In the earlier style, they're more realistic. They make the object of the subject look more realistic. Morley was especially known for his commission work for America's first families. And this is a wonderful example of that. These are the three sons of Charles Fisher. Fisher and his brother founded Fisher Auto Body, Body by Fisher. I don't know if you're old enough to remember those ads on the Body by Fisher. And they made automobile, well, first coach. They made horse-drawn coaches, but then eventually they made automobile coach bodies that were sold to General Motors. In 1926, Fisher and his brother were bought out by General Motors, and and the company became part of General Motors. And Charles Fisher, took his money and bought the Dixiana Farms in Lexington, Kentucky, and you see his boys out. Then he raised thoroughbred horses. That was his hobby. So you see his boys probably. I'm sure this was taken from a photograph. I know it was because I've seen the photograph in the Lennox archives. Black and white photograph, and then it just has notes on the back that the boys are wearing red jackets and black hats, and that the colors of the chestnut color of the horses and so forth. And so Morley took those notations, looked at a black and white photograph, and came up with this. But and as much fun as this plate is, the real treasure of this exhibition, I think, are the 30 plates that are assembled here that were painted for Charles Roebling. Charles Roebling is the son of the great bridge builder John Roebling, famous for the Brooklyn Bridge and other suspension bridges. Charles Roebling, after his father died, became president of the company. There were several Roebling sons. He was perhaps the wealthiest of them. He had a large house in Trenton, and he was a very avid orchid collector. And I'm just showing you in this first slide, orchids named after him. That means he developed these in his greenhouse. He developed these variations in his greenhouse. One is Cattleya, and the other is in the Vanda species. And there are other ones that he developed as well. He was quite well known as a collector of orchids. And the sale of his collection following his death was reported in the New York Times. Now, orchids and orchid collecting and orchid growing was a big deal, and it had been going on it went on for most of the second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Today it's hard to imagine this because you can go to Walmart and buy orchids. But this was really the hobby of very rich men. And what's so wonderful about these plates is they're all orchids that he grew, that were growing in his greenhouse. So these are actually portraits of flowers. And presumably he used them as place plates and also as cabinet plates, having them in cabinets to admire. In the article in the Times reporting that Mrs. Frederick Dixon of Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Philadelphia, finally bought the collection for $28,000, and that was considered nothing. That she had gotten this fabulous collection for practically no money. In describing this, the reporter wanted the readers to know that, quote, Roebling had sent expeditions into the mountains of South America to search for rare varieties, and his collection is estimated to have cost several $100,000 to accumulate, and Mrs. Dixon had bought it for a mere $28,000 in 1919, which again is no small amount of money, but still nothing compared to what he had lavished on the collection himself. Well, China painting declined precipitously after Morley's death. He died in 1935. There were still China painters who were willing to paint these plates, but there were very few customers by that time. And China painting at Lennox was relegated to two types. One was the painting of prototypes, and that's what we're looking at here. This is a prototype of a 12.5-inch chop plate that was either painted by Simon Leeson or painted for him. And one of the things that went on in the Lennox workshops well into the 1980s, because I observed it when I first started working around the fringes of the company as the curator and archivist, they were still doing the original designing of plate patterns into the 1980s by painting directly on plates. So we don't know if this plate actually has says Simon Lissam down here, but I don't know if he actually painted it or if it was painted by another China painter from his designs. So the painting of prototypes continued at the company for many, many years. And the other thing that continued was that into the 1950s, they continued to paint these little Demitasse cups for ladies who had coffee and tea, who still practiced that art. By 1955, these weren't available. And Jan Nosek, who did some of the best vase painting out there and plate painting, you'll see that, notice that when you go around. He was the lone exhibitionist kind of China painter still working in the studios at Lennox in the 1950s, and this is what he was turning out. And so the fine art of China painting, of painting on China, passed from the American experience, and Lenox China's post-World War II brand, which was dedicated to brides with occasional forays into White House China, massive services for use in the White House. That's the way we know of Lenox today, and it has totally overwhelmed this magnificent artful past, the original conception of the company. It's sort of sad and sort of wonderful at the same time, you know, because the Bushes did order some china before they left the White House. The company didn't get it delivered until about 3 days before the new administration. But anyway, I want to say thanks to the University of Richmond Museums and Richard Waller for recognizing the gap in our knowledge about this wonderful moment in time when art was lavished on what we think of as very common things. And thank you all for listening to me talk about this as you make your way up and into the gallery. I know we have a pretty good sized crowd here, but I'll try to point out a few things for you right in the exhibition.